listening to the Art of Making a Home podcast with Sandro Stefanuci, a home builder with over 37 years of experience in the industry. This series shows you the construction industry from the contractor's perspective. As well, what is it really like to work with the many different types of industry experts like interior designers, architects, and subtrades? And a lot of our friends in those positions are going to come on during this podcast and have a discussion with us about what it's like to work with the contractor and really what is it like to build a home. We all want to share our expertise with you so you can make the right decisions when it comes to wanting to build your dream home. So let's get started.
Hello, beautiful people. It's Sandro Stefanuci, and we're here today to talk about passive versus net zero. Now, first of all, what is passive and what is net zero? So they're very two different types of modeling for building high performance homes. Passive is a very strict set of regulations and rules in how you build the home, and there's prescriptions and there's targets that you need to meet as you build a home, and the designer has a lot to do with how that home gets put together and if it's going to meet the standard that you're wanting to achieve. Now, passive house, there is 3 standards that they use. They have classic passive house, there's classic plus, and classic premium. So the classic one is just basically their regular standards, which is a lot of insulation. It uses very little energy, and it doesn't necessarily have a primary renewable source, which could be like photovoltaic panels, or in some cases you can actually use wind turbines to be able to power your home as well. But in general, so it doesn't have any photovoltaic panels on it whatsoever. It'll maybe use fossil fuels or electricity to use the little power that it does need to operate the home. You get the plus, and the plus has a little bit of a renewable source of energy. So typically photovoltaic panels are on that home. And in the plus category, you're going to probably produce as much energy as you consume in a year. That's just a plus. That also is, again, it's a little bit higher standard than your classic. And then you go to the premium, which actually produces more energy in a year and actually be able to put that power back into the grid and be able to obviously help out the resources and produce power. And then we can get some, all the houses are doing that, wow, that'd be fantastic. You'd be putting power back into the grid instead of taking power out of the grid and not being able to renew it. So that's kind of a cool thing. So basically, in general, those are the 3 standards for passive house. And again, there's very, very strict regulations and types of criteria that you need to meet in order to achieve all those levels. And obviously, they'll come with different price tags onto those as you build. Now, let's go to net zero, because I think net zero, we'll just kind of discuss a little bit about the different styles of houses and in the high performance category. So then we have net zero. There's net zero ready and net zero ready as far as it has in the photovoltaic panels and consuming it. So net zero homes, the criteria for that is to produce as much energy as you consume in a year. So that home will have that photovoltaic panels on there. And again, it'll produce as much energy as it consumes in a year. The net zero ready home will have everything designed for photovoltaic panels and have all the other components that you need to achieve that net zero value already in the home, except it doesn't have the photovoltaic panels on there. So it's something, again, if you're, if you don't want to put them in right away, you can still build the home that will achieve that net zero standard eventually by putting photovoltaic panels on there. So again, you're going to be saving your cost. Typically, it's hard to say as far as cost goes for photovoltaic panels. You're about $3 per kilowatt hour per panel. So typically, a panel on average home is probably about $30,000 to get that on there. And some just may not have the budget necessary to do that, but it's a great way. And we will have to be building to that standard net zero ready by 2032 here in BC. One of the most asked questions is how much does it cost compared to a standard home? And that really depends on the style of house you're building and how complicated you want to get with the home itself. You're really going to build something that architecturally has lots of corners and angles and roof pitches and a ton of windows and those kinds of things. So I guess you have to kind of look at that and decide which way you want to go, whether you want to go passive or you want to go to net zero. You can do a little bit more flexibility with net zero, in my opinion, opposed to passive, which is definitely more rigorous type of set of standards that you need to meet. So in general, numbers that I come up with, I think on a typical house for net zero, you're probably in the $60,000 to $90,000 category for just an average home, maybe 2,500 square foot, 2,800 square foot home, as opposed to passive house. Again, that's even harder to come up with because the design for those there's just so many variations in the design. But I think you could probably be looking at about the same if you were to keep the overall design of structure and that very simplistic. So there should be some trade-offs. So if somebody really wants to get into a passive type home, I think if they're willing to, and say they don't have an unlimited budget, like most people don't, they can get into a very simplistic design, and try to keep the building envelope fairly simple, roof line simple, and that way they can save on the architecture, and then they can put the money into a lot of insulation and the things that you need to do for passive house, and take those trade-offs. And then later on, you can, put architectural features outside later on your house that are not attached to the home, just to spruce it up a little bit. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, it might be pretty plain looking if you wanted to save the money on the overall cost and kind of bring it down to maybe a more reasonable level in budget. The net zero home, as we talked about, is probably, like I said, 60 to 90,000, typically more. It could be even more than that, depending on how you're building it too. But those parameters, I think, apply as well to the net zero home, where you can be a little more simplistic in your design so you can get a better energy efficient, high performing home, right? So it gets very complicated. Those can be harder to get to those standards that you want to achieve. When you're typically building a net zero and or passive home, orientation of your home, as opposed to the way that the sun comes up and down, you're trying to situate that home or face that home in a south facing way. And then what you do from that is you put shading that cuts off the angle of the heat in the sun time, lets the winter time sun get in, so you get your passive solar heat gain kind of in the cooler months, and then in the summer months when it gets hot out, that it's actually the shading will keep that heat away from the windows and stuff, which causes a lot of heat gain in your home too. So that's orientation of the home. Both of them are very critical, especially if you got photovoltaic panels. You don't want to be putting it on the north side of your house that doesn't get any sun, because what's the point of doing that? So they always look at orientation of your home. That's very important. The use of shading, that we talked about that already. So I think we hit lots of points here. The doors and the windows, which we really haven't talked a lot about, but those are very important too. So your outside envelope. So you got high performing windows, high performing doors, solar heat gain coefficients, what they talk about windows. So your local window manufacturer will know that. In the Passive House Institute, they'll have companies that are registered that'll have the criteria that meet the passive house standard, not necessarily for net zero, but they will have a solar heat gain coefficient that they're trying to run. So there's a different metric that they use on it, but nevertheless, both of them are super high efficient products. Same with the doors as well too. So there is difference definitely in doors. So all that helps build that envelope around your home to keep you, like that jacket that you have that holds that heat in and keeps the heat out in the summertime, keeps the heat in the wintertime, and so forth. Even things like bathroom fans and stuff like that, the technology around fans that are recirculating the air and getting that stale air out of your home, that's greatly improved. So we look at those energy consuming products as well when the passive house is being built. One question that's been asked, is there any misconceptions about passive home or net zero home? And I think there's probably a lot of different opinions on that, just because people just don't necessarily know. And the misconception, I think, would be the number one that I hear about is the cost of it, right? It's just like, oh, it costs so much to do it and stuff like that. Well, I think if you do some proper planning and you're, willing to, compromise, I think that you can get that standard and not pay a whole bunch more for it. So it definitely, when we talk about that as being a motivator for people deciding whether to do that or not, we have to keep in mind, like right now, our energy costs for electricity here, especially in BC, we got clean power from our dams and so forth, but that's going to change. Our prices are going to start going up. And you look at the other parts of the world, especially the UK and Europe, and that there's a ton of passive houses being built there because their energy consumption is so costly. Even just running a fan. We have friends that are from London, and some of their friends don't even turn a fan on because it costs so much to run the power. So if you could imagine having that, how much money you'll save just by putting it into a passive home. And not only that, but it's healthy, right? If you were to not run a fan in a home that's not healthy, a standard home, you're going to get sick. And then what does it cost to get yourself better? That kind of thing. So that would be the number one, I think, misconception I have or heard about is really the cost. Just think about this for a minute. When I was thinking about passive house, and which was actually taught to me a while ago, the passive house, just say you had a hairdryer, say a 1500 watt hairdryer. Can you imagine that heating your whole home? With passive house, that's pretty much it. You can heat the whole home with that. And that's not a lie. So it's interesting that you can basically use that little energy and to heat up a whole home. Anyways, guys, I hope that you find this helpful. And if you have any questions, by all means, just shoot some questions over to us, and we'll be glad to answer them the best we can. Okay, guys, thank you. I think that's a wrap for today. Thank you so much for listening. We'll talk to you guys soon. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to The Art of Making Home. Make sure you follow us on one of your favorite platforms to listen to podcasts, either it be Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, or many more. You can find all our information at anchor.fm/artofhome. And if you want to email us as well for any questions from our guests or Sandra about building your home, all you have to do is send us a message at the Art of Making Home Podcast at gmail.com. We'll talk to you next time.